So I want to say good afternoon to everybody on this steamy Washington, D.C. day. My name is Bob Perciasepe. I'm president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's a great turnout. We're really very excited. You know, we're releasing a Pathways report, Pathways 2050, Pathways for Decarbonization, and it's a pretty timely moment, we think, to be talking about this. Republican members of Congress starting to say, here's some ideas we might be interested in. Other folks in the Democratic Party saying, well, maybe we could modify it this way. And so it's a conversation that we haven't had in a while. And so it's important that we start to bring people into these conversations. And we see this as a real opportunity to do that. And we want to seize that opportunity to do that. So Climate Innovation 2050 is our broad program and project that we're working on. And with it, we've brought together 24 leading companies. And this is one of the constituencies that's vital to us, to moving and making progress on climate change, to grapple with what does it really mean to decarbonize the United States economy. And actually, back in February of this year, we had an event up on the Hill where we actually had an early product from this process, which was some near-term actions that Congress could take in this Congress that would be moving in the right direction based on the work that was being done. And some of those things are actually gaining traction. But let me move to the next thing, which is what we're about today. So we're pleased to share today the next major output from the Climate Innovation 2050 project. And it looks further into the future than what can we do in this Congress, and to the challenges we all face to do the kind of decarbonizing work that we need to do by the middle of the century. The report that we're releasing today, Pathways to 2050, is a culmination of our year-long collaboration with companies, and it was to envision alternative scenarios that might be drivers to the decarbonization and the reduction of greenhouse gases. And our target was at least 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. And on our website is both the full report and some interactive digital charts and graphs. And I think these scenarios are interesting for a number of really important reasons. Because they add to a fairly robust body of existing work that's been done on decarbonization and what kind of work needs to be done to achieve those goals. But here we're looking at beyond technology pathways. We're trying to look broader at some of the social and policy dimensions that need to be brought into the conversation as we look forward. It's not just, should we have more nuclear? Or should we have carbon capture? Or can we do it with 100% renewable? These are important discussions that are going on, but also what's going to drive that to happen? What's going to stimulate it to move forward? We are still extremely pleased that BP and National Grid are here to join us. Some had to fly and dodge through the thunderstorms to get here, and we're very excited about that, especially if riding in those planes. A quick word about next steps after this process of Climate Innovation 2050, the process of these scenarios and these pathways, is we're going to then work for the rest of the year with these companies and perhaps more on a broader U.S. decarbonization strategy. So here's some pathways that might get us there, and obviously in the real world it'll probably be a mix of many of these things. But we're now going to look at what is the strategic framework we're going to need to get there. How does that break down, and how does it become relevant at the sector level? What is transportation looking at? What is agriculture looking at? So our next step after this today, and you'll be hearing more about this later in the year, we'll be looking at that. So before I turn it over to our first panel, I just want to, being a nonprofit, it's always important to thank your donors. I want to thank the people who've made climate innovation possible, the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Energy Foundation, and the Intel Corporation. There's always room for more, but I want to thank those donors at this time. And with that, I'd like to introduce the first panel, Elliot Derringer of C2ES, Ben Preston of the RAND Corporation, and Jay Edmonds of the Joint Global Change Research Institute. Elliot, come on up.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be joined by Ben and Jay and presenting an overview of this new work. As Bob mentioned, this has been a very collaborative exercise. You'll see in the report that in addition to the many companies that participated, Ben, Jay, and I were joined by several colleagues in our respective institutions. So I'd like to start by acknowledging our co-authors, a couple of whom are here in the audience actually, but they include Rob Lempert of RAND, Leon Clark and Matthew Binstead, who, I see Leon, I saw Matthew, yep, as well as Tom Wild. And they're from the different institutions that make up the Joint Global Change Research Institute, which, in case you don't know, is based at the University of Maryland. Brad Townsend of C2ES will be up here a bit later to introduce our speakers from BP and National Grid. I'm going to leave most of the heavy lifting to Ben and Jay. Ben to describe the process we undertook and the scenarios that resulted, and Jay to highlight some of the modeling results and the key takeaways. But I'd like to preface their remarks with a few thoughts on what it is we set out to do. This was essentially a collective exercise in peering into the future. There are many different reasons you might look into the future. One, of course, would be to shape that future, and that's really going to be the aim of the next stage of this project, as Bob was describing, the U.S. decarbonization strategy that we plan to release later this year. The aim of this phase really was to first better understand the various forces and choices that may bear on that future, and to envision some of the ways they may play out. We're not the only ones, of course, engaging in this sort of climate crystal balling. Some of you may have heard an interesting story on NPR back in March. It was called It's 2050, and this is how we stopped climate change. And it offered three different visions, one based on mass electrification, one based on urbanization, and one based on reinventing agriculture. Interestingly, you'll see elements of all three of those visions reflected in the scenarios that we came up with. I thought that NPR story was an especially thoughtful piece of journalism because it communicated that even if you all agree on the goal, there are many, many different ways to get there, and the choices are ours. In our case, this scenario process, the operative goal was, as Bob said, reducing U.S. emissions 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. And that's a goal that's consistent with the Paris Agreement goal of achieving greenhouse gas neutrality at the global level in the latter half of the century. We considered a host of factors, including technology, policy, corporate behavior, consumer behavior, finance, and shifting demographics. We relied on the companies to help ground truth the scenarios, and we relied on Jay and his team of modelers to test whether they could, in fact, get us to that 80% reduction. It may be obvious, but it's probably worth underscoring nonetheless, and that's what scenarios are not. They are not attempts to predict the future. They're merely attempts to describe possible futures. The process of envisioning these possible futures really forces you to think hard about your assumptions, about factors you might never have considered before, and about the many uncertainties lurking out there. We learned a lot through this process, and our hope today is that you do too. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Ben to describe the process and the resulting scenarios.
Okay, thanks, Elliot. Thanks for all of you for coming. Thanks particularly to the companies that worked with us on this project and made it fun. So my job is to get you a bit oriented into this scenario process, at which point I'll hopefully not confuse you, and then hand you off to Jay, who will talk about how we took these scenarios and modeled them to generate quantitative information. Before I do that, if you are here, you probably understand the challenge that's ahead of us. If we're trying to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees or even to 1.5 degrees, we need to decarbonize the US economy and the global economy, and we need to do it quickly, and that is no easy task. There are a wide variety of ways by which we can do that, but they're uncertain, right? We're not really sure which pathway we're on right now. We're not entirely sure which pathway we're going to be on in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. We're not sure who's going to lead, who's going to follow. So part of this scenario process does help explore that uncertainty and give us options going into the future. So as Elliot said, what are scenarios? He said what they're not, so I'm going to tell you what they are. They are plausible ways in which the future might play out. An emphasis on plausible, not necessarily likely. Okay, so you have some flexibility to be creative and explore some ideas or scenarios that are out there, but they shouldn't be impossible. They should be diverse, because we don't want to just have one solution. It's not a prediction. We want to be able to look at trade-offs across different scenarios. We want to compare and contrast, because we actually learn more that way. And they should be relevant. And that's particularly where the companies come in to make sure this is not just an academic exercise where we sit around and dream about the future, but it's designed to create something that's actually useful for companies and civil society. So what we've tried to do with these scenarios is take 3 scenarios that ultimately end up in the same place, which is a decarbonized US economy, mostly 80% reductions by mid-century. How we get there varies. Okay, so the pathway, the transition from the current state to the future state could vary, and they could vary for a number of reasons. Again, differences in leadership, differences in technology, differences in policy. So what we're really trying to do is explore that transition period. Okay, so the objective, develop 3 scenarios, each of which gets us to 80% emissions reductions. And as Bob alluded to, the goal here was not just to start with a temperature target and then figure out what technology gets us there. The goal was to understand decarbonization from the perspective of individual actors. Who does what? Who has to lead? Who has to follow? How do you collaborate? How do you cooperate to achieve change? All right, so how do we do this? Well, first and foremost, we started by engaging with the companies to understand from their perspective how this scenario exercise should be run, what should the key elements of the scenarios be, what should be included, what does it mean for a scenario around decarbonization to be plausible. So from that, we sort of got the basic building blocks from the scenarios. We defined modeling parameters that we're going to feed into the modeling that Jay's going to talk about. We developed larger qualitative storylines to describe these scenarios, and then ultimately integrated the modeling back in. So we get this hybrid approach that's an interesting story about the future that's actually grounded in sort of state-of-the-art modeling results. Now, this was an iterative process, so we went through this a couple of times, and to be honest, the first time we went through this, it didn't work. Okay? None of our scenarios got us to 80% emissions reductions. Okay? And part of the reason why is because the way we originally conceived this was each scenario revolved around one actor taking a dominant role. The federal government's going to do everything. The state government's going to do everything. But what we found is with one actor acting by themselves, we just couldn't get to where we needed to be. Okay? So that led us to iterate and revise the scenarios, which leads to sort of one of the big messages here is, regardless of where your starting point is, everybody has to participate at some point. Everybody has to cooperate to get you your goal. And particularly important, public support is essential. And this is one of the key messages coming from the companies was, well, look, it's fine to talk about a carbon tax coming from the federal government, but where does that carbon tax come from if the public doesn't actually support it? So right there, you've got 2 actors that have to be working together. Okay, so the 3 scenarios, of course, we came up with clever illustrative names for them. So they are a competitive climate, climate federalism, and low-carbon lifestyles. The icon should give you a hint of what's to come as I try and talk through these. But each one has a sort of unique mix of policy drivers, combinations of actors working in cooperation, a different set of policy mixes, and also a different set of motivating factors. So I'm going to sketch out each one of these briefly before handing it over to Jay to talk about the modeling. So a competitive climate. So the real driver here is essentially international trade. So what's happening in the rest of the world with respect to a price being put on carbon, carbon tariffs, U.S. trade being penalized by other nations because we're essentially falling behind in addressing climate change, moves us to act. And it moves us to act aggressively. Rather than to follow, we decide we're going to take ownership of this, be an international leader in terms of pursuing low carbon technologies and low carbon policies. We want to corner the market on energy tech and low carbon energy tech. This requires close collaboration between the federal government and the private sector, and states are there, of course, playing a complementary role in sort of implementing the policies coming from the federal government. So a few key features. This includes a federal top-down carbon price that's just around the corner. It comes in 2024. Includes aggressive greenhouse gas emissions vehicle standards, and it includes essentially a strong emphasis on RD&D. Essentially, all of these scenarios require large-scale transformations in technology, and the federal government supporting that. The states are doing things like developing clean energy standards, building codes. The businesses are investing in RD&D themselves. The consumers, again, they're supportive of these aggressive policies for various reasons and various motivations. And some of the technologies that are key are the expansion of nuclear, carbon capture and storage associated with the power sector, battery storage, and cellulosic biofuels. Climate federalism is a little bit of a different flavor. So here, the key motivating factor is not necessarily the federal government right off the bat, but states. And what are states responding to? A couple of things. One, they're starting to get beat up more and more by the impacts of climate change. And that's not hard to imagine when you think about some of our East Coast states, or where I am, California, that suffered through a rough wildfire season or 2 or 3 or 4 over the past several years. The other thing they're responding to is simply opportunities that exist in the marketplace. And that's also not surprising, where we have many states around the country that are already taking leadership in terms of developing state-based regional climate policy, investing in technology. So what's happening here? So the federal government still plays a role. Why does the federal government play a role? Well, because you've got a lot of these companies screaming bloody murder about this sort of patchwork of policies that are emerging at the state level. Some states are acting, some are not. That's a difficult operating environment for companies. So eventually, the federal government does step in to impose a carbon price in 2031 to level the playing field in that regard. The states are expanding existing carbon markets or creating new carbon markets and imposing clean energy standards for electricity and transportation. Businesses are under a bit of pressure from the sort of fractured landscape. You have shareholders and investors saying, you know, this seems like a very inefficient way to run a climate policy regime, so that's where the pressure comes on the federal government. Again, consumers are supporting action and starting to, I guess, vote with their wallets and making their own investments in low energy technologies and vehicles. And the technologies here are a strong emphasis on renewables and electric vehicles. Some of this technology, however, is coming from overseas, right, as opposed to being developed here in our first scenario. And then lastly, low carbon lifestyles is kind of a completely different flavor, right? So here, this is much more of a bottom-up scenario. Emphasis here is what's happening at the local level, what's happening in cities and urbanization and changing demographics. What's happening with local uptakes of technology, local innovation. Again, we're seeing examples of this around the country right now. There's a combination of innovation in private companies as well as very, very strong consumer demand. So in some ways, the people are leading the way and prioritizing their preferences for low carbon technologies, and that's driving changes all the way back up. So federal government, here you don't see this sort of top-down carbon tax, but federal government is investing in RD&D. Again, you need that technology push, and they're supporting around the margins in terms of thinking about resilient infrastructure or how infrastructure investments made by the federal government can benefit low carbon futures. States are expanding and integrating carbon trading particularly when you have a strong sort of a city that's leading the way. So think places in Southern California, places in New York, Illinois, we have the Chicagos, the New Yorks, the LAs, the San Franciscos that are big players in driving what happens at the state level. Businesses take a voluntary approach. So to some extent, they see the writing on the wall, they see what's percolating up from the bottom up from consumers, and voluntarily opt to pledge to reduce their own emissions by 90%. So in some ways, there's a sort of shadow price on carbon. We've already talked about the strong push coming from consumers, but the emphasis here is that consumers are able to sort of see their own impact. So their impact, the ability to buy low carbon products, technology, services is transparent, right? So you can actually see the carbon in what you're buying. And essentially, again, a whole raft of technology breakthroughs. These in particular are sort of happening at the local level, creating new business models, new innovation that's enabling this change within cities. So that's an overview. Hopefully that those sort of different flavors are useful and you get your head around that. Because now I'm going to hand it off to Jay, who's going to talk about how we took these sort of narratives, these qualitative pieces, and actually model them to get some quantitative results. So Jay, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Elliot. Thanks to C2ES and the sponsors that made this all possible for you who are coming here, and particularly to my colleagues, Tom Wild and Leon Clark and Matthew Binstead, who made doing the science and technology part of this work a real pleasure. So let me move briskly on. Let's see. Yes. So the first piece is what's the tool we used? And the tool we used is called the Global Change Assessment Model. It's actually a community model. You can get it off of our website and you can download it, the data, and the instructions on how to use this. And if you find any mistakes in it, you can report it back and we'll fix them. But the model itself is actually a really helpful way to understand the scenarios. And the thing about the model is it keeps you straight. It does your counts. It keeps you from double counting things. It tells you about the feedbacks. It tells you about synergies. The GCAM model takes assumptions about, I don't know if that's giving, there's not much of a light, but it takes assumptions about the socioeconomics, how many people there are, where are they, what's the level of economic activity, what's labor productivity. It takes assumptions about the technologies that are available in the elements of the Global Change Assessment Model, the energy system. What are the resources? How do you get those resources out of the ground? How do you transform them? What are you going to transform them into? So the model is doing all that. Who wants the energy, and what are they going to do with it if they buy this stuff? And so it's tracking all of that information. And the stuff on the left-hand side over there, the socioeconomics, the technologies, the policies, the resources, the financial environment, all of those are the assumptions that go into the model. And so we have to produce that. And what Ben was just describing for us was exactly that. What were the kind of assumptions that we were using to create these scenarios? And then the role of the model is taking those assumptions and telling you, what did that imply? And if you're trying to get to 80%, it turns out to be a really handy thing if you can have a model do the work of the calculations to figure out, did I make it to 80% or not? And as Ben pointed out, and I think Elliot may have pointed out as well, on our first pass through this, we didn't. Our assumptions weren't adequate to the task, and we'll show that in just a second. And then the other thing is that the model is going to tell you about the interactions. So if we want bioenergy in the GCAM model, that's grown on some piece of land. Is that land available? Is somebody growing corn there? If they're not growing, if they're growing corn there, do you have to buy them out? Do you have the water that you need to irrigate the crops? And so it's going to keep us all on the straight and narrow. So having said that as the setup, let me just talk a little bit more about the kinds of assumptions, just review what Ben was telling us in just a moment before. We have policies, and they've kind of fallen into about 5 different bins in terms of the types of policies that we look. And so we had policies, for example, that were carbon price type policies. These are highlighted in a competitive climate, as Ben was pointing out, also in climate federalism, but they don't occur in the same timing, in the same places. In low-carbon lifestyles, they're limited to states. Clean energy standards that also occur in these scenarios. Building codes, which occur in all of these scenarios. And then company actions, voluntary power sector emissions reductions. Those occur in low-carbon lifestyles. Consumer preferences, finance, lower financing costs for low-carbon technologies. These are in the low-carbon lifestyles scenarios. Technology, you see technology assumptions about improved technology that are in all 3 of these scenarios, but each one sort of explores a different element. For example, the first, the cellulosic ethanol, the improvements in the cellulosic ethanol are in the competitive climate scenario. In the climate federalism, we explore a different pathway. Technology improves for fuel cells, and hydrogen becomes a more important element of that scenario in terms of the fuels. In all of the scenarios, we have improved batteries. The batteries improve over time, so we have battery electric vehicles that are in these scenarios. Remember, these are the things that we bring to the model that allow us to get a scenario off the ground. And so in this figure, what we see is the bottom line. Carbon emissions on the left-hand axis, net greenhouse gas emissions, and millions of metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So because we have non-CO2 greenhouse gases, we have to do this transformation back and forth between methane and CO2, between nitrous oxide and CO2. All of the non-CO2 greenhouse gases have to be accounted for. And you can, the thing that pops out immediately is two observations, at least to my eye. One is that all 3 of the scenarios that we crafted got to 80% reductions in emissions by the year 2050. And the other is that in the reference scenario, that is the scenario where we didn't introduce these assumptions about policies, about technologies, about consumer behavior, where those were absent, basically the US went on with flat emissions. And so the thing that pops out is that by 2050, the world is really, really different. And that's the first take-home message. It's pretty much the obvious. That is, decarbonizing the US economy requires fundamental shifts in the way we generate energy, produce goods, deliver services, and manage lands. And this figure is, looks kind of busy and complicated, but actually it really tells you the essence of the story of decarbonization. And it encapsulates, this is a step diagram, it encapsulates the basic strategies that pretty much every deep decarbonization scenario employs. The first is, let's start with the energy sector. Those are the first 3 dark blue blocks there. And you can see the emissions stepping down in the decarbonization of the energy system. And they step down, first of all, with improved energy efficiency. So all scenarios that have deep decarbonization have improved energy efficiency embedded in them. Second step is decarbonization of the power sector. The power sector gets decarbonized. And it's because you've got a lot of options for decarbonizing the power sector. You've got renewable energy forms, you've got wind, you've got solar, you've got potentially bioenergy, you have nuclear power. You have lots of different ways that you can get the carbon out of the power sector. And so decarbonizing the power sector is kind of the number 2 thing that goes on. And then the third is we substitute low carbon fuels in end use applications, in the buildings, in our heating, our cooling, our cooking, in industry, in raising heat, in raising steam, in process heat, in all of the applications. You begin to substitute electricity and other lower carbon to energy fuels throughout the end use sectors. And then those three steps are the energy sector. But then you also have some other parts of the economy. You have the ability to capture CO2, and so CO2 capture and storage is potentially an important element of the story. We have CO2 removal technologies, and it's actually possible to take something like bioenergy, which has carbon in it, but which got its carbon from the atmosphere, and to scrub that carbon out and put it underground rather than back into the atmosphere, which leads to a net removal of carbon from the environment. And finally, we have the non-CO2 greenhouse gases, reducing the emissions from non-CO2 greenhouse gases, and then utilizing carbon sinks, including land use sinks, where we have the ability to either move carbon into the system by afforestation or through other transformations that lead to higher carbon densities on the land. And so those are the elements of all of the carbon removal strategies.
Where are electric vehicles in that?
In the transportation sector, and so electric vehicles would be part of the fuel switching. And we'll come back to that. Let's see, where was that question? Okay, yeah. So that'll be part of the fuel switching story, and actually it's a really interesting story, so I'm glad you brought it up. I was going to do it anyway, but. This part of the story is that, that's the generic strategy. But we created three scenarios. Now, the generic strategy may be the same, but the composition is going to be a little bit different in each one of these parts of the story. And so if you look at the CO2 removal technologies, they play a much bigger role here in the competitive climate than they do in climate federalism. If you look at the land use change emissions reductions, they play a much bigger role in the low carbon lifestyle scenario than they do in the other three. So these pathways can actually diverge fairly significantly over time. And here's the power sector. You can see how the competitive climate scenario, basically it's a straight line down, that in the low carbon lifestyles, you're never quite as far down as the a competitive economy. And in the climate federalism, there's a delay. There's actually the rate of reduction. We still have a reduction. The rate of reduction isn't quite as fast as it is later when it accelerates. All of these scenarios, however, in the end, got to very deep decarbonization. And so that's one of the key messages. Negative emissions play a role in all of the scenarios. Some emissions are really hard to remove from the system, and having an offset that is economically competitive makes a huge difference in your ability to get to deep decarbonization in an economically efficient manner. You can see that prior to 2030, it's all about carbon in land use change emissions. But after 2030, by the time you get to the middle of the century, that's being augmented in all the scenarios by the use of bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage. So you're growing plants that take carbon out of the atmosphere. You then use those plants as an energy form. You capture the CO2 that's emitted when you have the combustion, put it underground, and the net change in the atmosphere, of course, is negative. So you're using those plants not only for their energy content, but also for their ability to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere. So that takes us to our third key point, which is decarbonization requires that everyone plays a role. And you can see that, as we pointed out earlier, in our first pass through this, when we had relatively modest thoughts about, well, would one actor's plenty for one scenario, we realized as we worked our way through that was not going to do the job. It only got us about halfway there. Eventually, everybody's got to play. If you have a scenario that gets 80% reduction in emissions by the year 2050, none of the sectors gets a free ride. Everybody's got to be close to 80%. And if a sector doesn't make it to 80%, then some other sectors got to pick up the slack. If the total is going to be at 80% reduction, then everybody's got to be very close. And so it's something that we need to bear in mind, that there are no free riders in deep decarbonization. Technology innovation plays a big role. This figure needs a little bit of explaining. It's got two axes. It's got electricity generation, and that's these colored stacks. And you can see that we have three different scenarios. The reference case, in which we don't have any of our policies assumed. An advanced technology case, in which we have an advanced electrification technology. And then we have a competitive climate. And then over here on the right axis, we have the total emissions. And the total emissions are those diamonds. And so you can see what the total emissions are, and in contrast to the energy. And so you can see these things as counterpoints to one another. And so the first thing to point out is that when we have the advanced electric technologies, the emissions didn't really change very much, because we didn't have the policy guidance, we didn't have the underlying supporting public support for these efforts, and therefore we didn't get much emissions mitigation. But when we combine that with the carbon tax in a competitive economy, you get deep decarbonization, roughly 90% reduction in emissions relative to the 2005. So that takes us to our final point. Sectoral responses are highly interdependent. The pathways depend on one another. I'm going to put up a figure to illustrate this. We're coming back to the battery electric vehicles. And the first point is, again, read this very similarly. You've got the emissions on the left-hand axis. And so in the reference scenario, you've got something north of 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent emissions from the transportation sector, deep blue, lighter blue, the power sector, the combination. Introducing the advanced battery electric vehicle technology alone, it's the only difference in the scenario, leads to some reduction because it's more efficient, you need less energy. But if you look at the red square, which is the electricity share of transportation and final energy, yeah, that goes up. It's almost to about 25%. Then you introduce a battery electric vehicle plus decarbonization of the power sector. That combination leaves the share pretty much in the same spot. You didn't really get a lot more vehicles into the mix. But what you did is you got rid of the power, because rather than, as occurred when the battery electric vehicle alone entered, yeah, you got the transport emissions down, but the power sector emissions went up in response. Here, you got the carbon out of transport, and you get very low emissions as a consequence. So let me turn it back over to Elliot to sort of finish us up with the final set of key findings.
Thanks, Jay. And in a moment, we're going to open it up to your questions and comments. But just to quickly recap, Jay has done a very nice job of walking us through some of the key takeaways you'll find in the report. He noted that decarbonization requires fundamental shifts across the economy. Those shifts can be achieved through a host of alternative pathways. They all require that everybody plays their part. Technological innovation is essential, but without adequate policy drivers is insufficient to get the job done. And sectoral responses are highly interdependent. I just want to highlight, you can see the bold-faced bullets up there on the slide are 3 additional takeaways that are contained in the report, so I just wanted to mention those as well. One is that the success of any of these pathways hinges heavily on higher levels of public support. Second, that decarbonization requires a broad suite of policies to drive investment and action and to provide a level playing field. And finally, that the private sector is an essential partner in any decarbonization pathway. So, with those takeaways, would love to hear from all of you now. So I think we have some roving microphones. If you have a question, just put your hand up. And if you could please just identify yourself with your question or comment. See, we've got some here. Who's got the mics? Okay. Why don't we start right here?
Oh. Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. This microphone is very loud. My name is Victoria. I'm from ARPA-E, and I had a question about the model that was used. So if we're kind of going by standard practices for building out renewables, there's a certain amount of emissions that's inherent in producing every next solar cell, every next wind turbine that you need in order to achieve the kind of increase in renewables ultimately. So I'm kind of wondering, does this model already include the emissions that will result due to like having to build out what is next necessary future? Yeah, right.
Yeah, we're gonna take a couple of questions and field them as a group. So I think I saw another hand over. Well, why don't you just pass it right in front of you there?
Hi, Rachel Jones with the National Association of Manufacturers. I was just curious about when you talked about some of the input assumptions, what were your kind of forecasting as it relates to GDP and other types of economic input assumptions? And then if you, I don't know if there were any outputs kind of related to economic activity and if we saw any changes or shifts either in different sectors or geographically, either within the US or externally.
Let's take one more. Oh, just past here, right.
Hi, Sarah Rispin, Duke University. My question is about the assumptions you made about technological developments still to come. So we are seeing great innovation in the renewable sector. We're also seeing a huge competition in the creation of new forms of energy storage, but some people say that we need to, for instance, crack seasonal energy storage to be able to store energy not just for 4 hours at a time or 12 hours at a time, but a month or an entire season's worth of energy. And similarly, I'd like to know about any assumptions you made about the technology for carbon capture, that certain parts of that are still unproven, and what are you assuming will be accomplished? Thanks.
And I'm going to ask Jay to start responding, but just want to point out to, if you haven't flipped all the way to the back of the report, there are some tables in the appendix that provide the detailed quantitative assumptions that were used in the modeling. There's one set that speaks to policies and other actions, and a second table that describes the particular technology assumptions used across the scenarios, so principally where we were projecting or suggesting that you would see cost reductions for specific technologies. Jay, why don't you pick it up?
Let's see. We've got one on feedback effects. That is that you've got emissions that are associated with the production of goods and services. And so we basically include that, not explicitly, and this is probably something where we should begin to bring that in. But essentially, it's treated as if it were kind of average economic activity. And so we don't specially try to track the economic consequences in the energy system. Now, we do track all of the consequences through agriculture and land use. So the bioenergy is grown on land, and so if you actually end up deforesting, that's all the indirect land use change emissions are tracked. They're tracked separately, and those are counted. But in terms of the capital, the construction of the capital is just assumed to be, average capital in the system. The assumptions about population and GDP, I'll have to go to the back of the book and drag those out. And what was the third? That was what the technology assumption. So we do assume that in the reference scenario, and that's actually one of the things I meant to point out when I was going through it, that we do have this continued technological improvement in that reference scenario, and it's only the fact that we have this continued technological improvement that keeps the emissions level in that reference scenario. Otherwise, the GDP would cause those emissions to drift up. So in the reference scenario, there's significant technological improvement. We actually did this figure some years ago in which we actually went through this exercise of pulling out how much technological improvement is embedded in these reference scenarios, and it's huge. It's just a huge amount. And so the technological improvements that we assumed were over and above those that are embedded in the scenario as a default.
Why don't we go over to this side of the room?
Thank you, Elliot. Anton Hufnagel with the German Embassy. One question on how you arrived at the 80% and whether that was ever being questioned as the necessary level of emissions reductions. In Europe, of course, a lot of countries are questioning whether substantial decarbonization is enough, whether we don't need to go to perhaps 95%. You know, the German industry did a similar exercise where they compared an 80% scenario and a 95% scenario. The IPCC report probably came at some point while you were in the middle of this exercise. Did you ever think of going beyond the 80? And if not, why not?
Any other questions right here?
Hi, my name is Samishi Kumar. I'm with Fossil Energy. I was curious if you could go a little bit more in depth about the industrial sector, because it's still roughly, 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the graph on page 19, I'm having a little difficulty understanding it, I guess, because it seems like it's displacement by the energy associated with industry sectors. I'm curious how you would decarbonize perhaps things like cement, urea, that kind of production, or ethanol. You know, it's a pure source of CO2, things like that.
So, all right, we'll take one more.
Sorry to make that. Hi, my name is Beth Zittler, and I'm with the National Academies. My question is about the interaction between different sectors of the economy and different actors in the scenarios. So you said that if some areas do more decarbonization, then that impacts obviously what other sectors do. And I was wondering if you could tell me about the mechanism of how that happens in the model. Is it just because of how you put the assumptions in, or does it shake out because of minimizing costs? And my understanding is this isn't a cost minimization model, right? Yeah, okay, good. So if you could explain how the interaction happens, that'd be great.
Great. And just a quick word on modeling. I'm hoping Jay might be available after to answer some of the particular questions about how the model operates and the particular findings. We relied on the modeling in this case really as a test to see whether the kinds of assumptions we were generating with respect to each scenario would get us to that 80%. We were cognizant that there's always some risk every time you introduce modeling into an exercise like this, that people become very focused on the numbers and the mechanism. And it's important to understand those, but for us, really, this was just a supporting tool in helping us visualize and test alternative futures. So I want to try to, sorry, Jay, but to some degree sort of de-emphasize the modeling aspect of the work, because it's not so much the specific numbers, other than that 80% number, that we're so focused on. In any case, another number question is the 80%, right? How did we get there? And really, our starting point there was the U.S. mid-century strategy that was developed late in the Obama administration, which aimed for roughly an 80% reduction. And we started on this project early last year, and that seemed like a handy reference point. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, that's a reasonable rough benchmark for where the U.S. needs to be in 2050 to be in line with the Paris Agreement goal of achieving greenhouse gas neutrality in the latter half of the century. And certainly there's been considerable discussion and debate over the last couple of years about whether we need to move even faster. And, you know, we're not, through this study, we're not taking a particular position on that question. We just needed a benchmark to start with. We put that out there, and everybody was good with it. So there wasn't really extensive discussion about the particular target level we were aiming for. We borrowed a starting point from the U.S. mid-century strategy. Everyone was comfortable with it, and that became the benchmark for the exercise. You want to speak to the modeling questions? Yes, you can still speak to modeling.
All right, let's see. Let's see, what was the first one? First one was the one you just showed. The second one was industry.
Yeah.
So the industry, you put your finger on probably the weakest part of the model. But you also highlighted the two pieces that are actually pulled out separately, which is cement, which has the, we can apply CO2 capture and storage to cement emissions. And refineries. So we actually have the ability to run both fossil fuels and biofuels through refineries. And those also have the ability to put CO2 capture and storage. And so decarbonizing those does have the option of CO2 capture and storage. And there are a variety of different technologies available depending upon the marginal cost of carbon in each one of those. So I think they start at 85% capture and work their way up. If the cost is high enough, you get up to 95% capture rates on those sectors. Otherwise, the industrial model has all of the different fuels that produce an energy service that is an aggregate energy service for the remaining industrial sectors. And high on our list of things to do is to pull those out and look at the individual industrial subsectors independently. Let's see, is there one other?
Third one was around the, I take it as I think the third question is really around, to some extent, around the sort of leakage issue. So it might be useful to reiterate that GCAM is a state-based model to look at interactions between sectors and also across geographies.
Right. So, I mean, all the sectors interact with each other. You solve all of the supplies, all of the demands, and all of the transformations simultaneously so that every buyer has a seller. There is no excess left over at the end. It is not an optimization model. We're not trying to find, your question. We're not trying to find the best. So you don't start with, hey, we're going to do 80%. What does it take to get to 80%? What's the best way to get to 80%? No, it's actually the opposite. We start with the assumptions about what the policies are, what the technology availability is, what the resource availability is, what the financial environment is, what consumer preferences are. And under those assumptions, that's why the first time we did this, we only get to 40% when everybody thought, oh, this is plenty to get to 80%. No, it wasn't. It was only 40%. And so we have to go back and try another set with more actors, with more stringent assumptions, until we eventually found a scenario that we thought was a reasonable and plausible set of assumptions about the actors and the environment in which they were acting. And that gave us, as a consequence, the 80% reduction relative to 2005 emissions.
So I know there are other questions. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on to the next part of the program to stay reasonably close on time. As we've noted, we had a lot of company involvement in the scenario exercise. A lot of companies have been undertaking similar analyses of their own internally, and that's what we're going to hear about next. I'm going to ask Brad Townsend to come up and introduce the next panel, but first, if you'd join me in thanking Jay and Ben.